The first voice on the call belonged to a UN logistics chief in Geneva, his accented English tinny and strained through the satellite connection. "Alex, the runway is a swamp. I'm looking at the satellite imagery now. Your C-130s will sink up to their axles. We cannot risk the aircraft." From my command center, which is to say, the spare bedroom of my beige suburban house, I took a calm sip of coffee. On my left monitor, I had the same satellite feed. On my right, a frantic group chat with my on-the-ground team in the Philippines. On my main screen, a dozen faces stared back at me, a global mosaic of stress and frustration. Warlords, typhoons, and bad bureaucracy. My Tuesday. "General," I said, my voice even, "we aren't using the C-130s. I told your aide that 3 times yesterday. We're chartering 2 Skyvans from a local contractor in Manila. They can land on a postage stamp, and the pilot owes me a favor after I got his last plane out of impound in Kinshasa." I didn't add that the favor involved a case of whiskey and a forged bill of lading, but the general got the picture. He grumbled, but he relented. Another fire put out, 10,000 miles away. In my old life, I thought, as I clicked end meeting, and the dozen anxious faces vanished. My biggest worry was a hijacked shipment of cholera vaccines. Now? I glanced out the window at my meticulously edged lawn. Now, it's whether my recycling bin is 3 inches too close to the curb. The silence of my house was the entire point. After 15 years working for Crisis Command, a high-octane NGO that basically airdropped project managers into the world's worst moments, I had cashed out. I was now a consultant, which meant I took 3 calls a week, dispensed advice that was usually ignored, and spent the rest of my time trying to lower my blood pressure. I'd chosen Maple Creek Estates for its sheer mind-numbing banality. The HOA rules were legendary, the drama was non-existent, and the biggest headline on the community message board was about a lost cat named Sprinkles. It was perfect. An email notification chimed, a digital harbinger of doom. The subject line, "A glorious monument to petty tyranny," was in all caps. Official HOA violation notice. Mailbox decorum. It was from her, Brenda. I opened it, and I had to admire the artistry. It was a masterwork of the form. "Dear Resident 142," it began, eschewing names for the cold, impersonal touch of a serial number. "It has come to our attention that your mailbox post fails to comply with Bylaw 7, Section 4, regarding appropriate exterior color palettes. As you know, all posts are to be painted antique linen, while yours appears to be eggshell white. A clear and jarring violation." Attached was a blurry photo, taken from across the street as if by a private investigator on a stakeout. You could just make out the offending mailbox post. It was indeed white. "Please rectify this violation within 48 hours, the email continued, pleased to the entire HOA board for maximum public shaming. "Failure to comply will result in fines of $50 per day, levied against your property. We do this to maintain the aesthetic integrity and property values of our community for everyone. Thank you for your prompt cooperation. Sincerely, Brenda, President, Maple Creek Estates, HOA." I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. This was so wonderfully, beautifully stupid. I once sourced 50 tons of UN-grade tarpaulin, in a city under siege. I was pretty sure I could handle a can of paint. The absurdity of it was the Ambien I needed to sleep at night. My eyes drifted to the postscript at the bottom of her email. P.S. A reminder that the community clubhouse will be closed for a deep cleaning and inventory this weekend. Please do not attempt to access the premises for any reason. That was odd. On the small TV in the corner of my office, a meteorologist was pointing at a swirling graphic in the Atlantic, Tropical Storm Ophelia. It was just a blip, a minor concern for shipping lanes, its projected path a wide, lazy curve away from any coastline. Still, a lifetime of identifying threats had honed my instincts. Closing the only county-designated emergency shelter in our zone for a deep cleaning, right at the start of hurricane season? It didn't track. It was an anomaly, a piece of data that didn't fit the pattern, and if there was one thing I knew, it was that ignoring anomalies gets people killed. Or, in this case, Probably just fine for using the wrong kind of mulch. I dismissed it, closed the laptop, and went to find out what antique linen looked like. 3 days later, the air was thick, wet, and heavy. The kind of oppressive Florida humidity that feels like you're breathing soup. Ophelia had been upgraded to a Category 1 hurricane, but the news anchors were still reassuring everyone that the storm's track was keeping it safely offshore. It was just close enough to make the weather miserable. I decided a trip to the community pool was in order. As I walked down the block, I saw my next-door neighbor Dave wrestling with a massive, inflatable flamingo that was fighting him in the slight breeze. Dave was a good guy, a laid-back IT consultant who worked from home and shared my appreciation for the neighborhood's general lack of excitement. "Fighting the good fight, I see," I called out. He grunted, finally getting the flamingo under his arm. "This thing has a mind of its own. You heading to the pool?" "Trying to," I said. Figured I'd get a swim in before the outer bands bring the rain. We walked together toward the clubhouse, the center of our little suburban universe. It housed the pool, a sad little gym, and the meeting room that, in case of emergency, became our shelter. As we got closer, I noticed the ground felt spongy. The normally pristine St. Augustine grass squished under my sandals. "They must have overdone it with the sprinklers," Dave commented, sidestepping a puddle. But the puddles grew larger, connecting into a shallow, marshy lake that surrounded the clubhouse entrance. A steady, deliberate stream of clear water was flowing from beneath the double glass doors. "Whoa," Dave said, stopping. "Looks like a pipe burst. That's gonna be a mess." I knelt, my professional instincts kicking in without my permission. I dipped my fingers in the water. It was cold. A hot water pipe burst would be warm, steamy. I looked at the flow. It wasn't the violent, high-pressure spray of a ruptured pipe. It was a constant, placid volume. My eyes followed the water's path around the building. "No," I said, standing up, "this isn't a pipe burst." I walked to the side of the building, to a small, landscaped alcove that housed the utility hookups, and there it was. A thick, green, industrial-grade hose, the kind the groundskeepers used to wash down the tennis courts, was connected to a high-flow spigot. The valve was turned all the way open. The hose itself was snaked carefully around a planter and pointed directly at the small gap under the clubhouse front doors. "Someone left the water on," I said, my voice flat. As if summoned by my discovery, the side door of the clubhouse creaked open and Brenda emerged, carrying an empty cardboard box. She was a woman in her mid-50s with a helmet of blonde hair that seemed impervious to the humidity, and a face permanently pinched in a state of mild disapproval. She saw us, saw the flood, and her face contorted into a mask of theatrical shock. "Oh my heavens," she gasped, a hand flying to her chest. "The sprinkler system, it must have malfunctioned. What a terrible, terrible accident." Dave looked from the hose I was pointing at, then back to Brenda. "The sprinklers are out on the lawn, Brenda." "This is coming from this hose," I added, my tone devoid of emotion. "It's been running for hours." Brenda's eyes darted between us. Her composure, usually as rigid as her hairdo, began to crack. I was just inside for a moment, cleaning out a few of my personal items from the storage closet before the deep clean. It must have been an accident. I must have knocked the hose when I came in." My internal monologue was screaming. Her personal items? In the county-designated emergency shelter? And she accidentally knocked a heavy hose, pointed it at a door, cranked the valve to full blast, and then conveniently left it there for hours? The lie was so audacious, so insulting in its lack of effort, that I almost respected it. "Let's turn it off and see the damage," I said, moving toward the spigot. "No," she shrieked, her voice suddenly sharp. "You can't. It's HOA property. There are liability issues. I have to call the management company first." I ignored her, walked over, and wrenched the sticky valve shut. The gurgling flow of water subsided. I went to the front doors and tried the handles, locked solid. I peered through the tempered glass panel, cupping my hands to block the glare. The inside was a scene of breathtakingly stupid destruction. The entire main room was submerged in at least 3 inches of standing water. But it was what was in the water that made me blink. Dozens of ruined, tangent-colored cots were floating aimlessly. Soggy cardboard boxes had burst open like overripe fruit, disgorging their contents into the manufactured swamp. And floating everywhere, in a brightly colored, waterlogged flotilla of failure, were hundreds of Beanie Babies. Princess Diana commemorative bears bobbed next to Tabasco the bull. A life-size plastic Santa, clearly part of a Christmas display, lay on its side like a casualty, its painted-on smile eerily cheerful as it drifted past a ruined first aid station. The entire place was Brenda's personal storage unit. Brenda was still yelling about bylaws and trespass. I pulled out my phone. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "I'm calling the non-emergency police line," I said calmly. "I'd like to report the willful destruction of public property at the Maple Creek Estates clubhouse." The responding officer's name tag read, Miller. He was a tall man with tired eyes and a posture that radiated a profound sense of, "I don't get paid enough for this." He climbed out of his patrol car with the world-weary sigh of a man who had been dispatched to this very address for similar nonsense in the past. "Brenda," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Of course. What is it today? Someone's petunias encroaching on the common area?" "Officer, thank goodness you're here." Brenda launched into her performance, playing the victim with practiced ease. "This man is making wild and baseless accusations. There's been a terrible plumbing accident, a sprinkler malfunction, and he's harassing me." I waited for her to run out of steam. "Afternoon, officer," I said, nodding towards the evidence. "Someone intentionally flooded the community emergency shelter. The hose is over there. The spigot was on full. The room is destroyed." Miller listened, his gaze shifting from Brenda's frantic pantomime to my calm report. He seemed to appreciate the lack of hysterics. With another sigh, he got the master key from Brenda, who handed it over with the reluctance of a queen surrendering her castle. He unlocked the door. We all stood there for a moment, bathed in the mildewy, stagnant air that washed out of the room. Miller stared at the soggy menagerie inside. His eyes lingered on a particularly sad-looking floating platypus. "I've seen some things," Miller muttered, more to himself than to us. "But a Beanie Baby flood? That's a new one." He shook his head. "Look, it's pretty obvious what happened here. But proving intent in court? That's a different story. Officially, this is a civil matter. It's up to the HOA to handle the cleanup and repairs." Brenda's face, which had been pale with worry, bloomed into a triumphant smirk. The law was on her side. She was untouchable. It was in that precise moment of her victory that fate, or perhaps the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, decided to intervene. Miller's police radio crackled to life with an urgent, crackly message. At the exact same instant, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. So did Dave's. So did Miller's. We all pulled them out. The screen on mine was stark white, with bold black and red letters. It was a National Weather Service alert. Hurricane Ophelia has rapidly intensified to a Category 3 storm. A hurricane warning is now in effect for this area. Expect landfall in approximately 72 hours. The smirk evaporated from Brenda's face. Dave's jaw went slack. Miller just stared into the room, at the floating Santa and the drowned teddy bears, the only designated shelter for 5 square miles. I looked at the waterlogged disaster, at Brenda's horrified face, and at the vibrating phone in my hand. My two worlds, the one I had run from and the one I had run to, had just collided with the force of a major hurricane. My internal monologue, which had been enjoying a peaceful retirement, snapped to attention. "Well," it said, dusting off its hands, "this is a disaster. My specialty." The hurricane alert hung in the humid air, thick and suffocating. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the ruined drywall inside the clubhouse. Dave looked like he'd seen a ghost. Brenda's face had cycled through triumph, shock, and was now settling on a pale, clammy shade of panic. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that she had created a problem that couldn't be solved with a sharply worded email. A switch flipped in my head. It was a feeling I knew well, a sudden, clarifying calm that washed over me in the first moments of a crisis. The annoyed, semi-retired homeowner, Alex Martinez, receded. In his place stood Crisis Commander Martinez. My brain, no longer occupied with the merits of antique linen, kicked into its operational cadence. A mental checklist unspooled, crisp and immediate, a process honed in the chaos of a dozen countries. 1. Secure the site. Prevent further contamination. 2. Assess critical damage. Structural, electrical, biological. 3. Establish a command structure. Identify key personnel. 4. Mitigate immediate threats. Water extraction, mold prevention. 5. Resource procurement. Identify deficits. Source, material. 6. Set a timeline. 72 hours until landfall. The clock is running. I turned to Dave. He was still staring at the watery mess, his flamingo float forgotten at his feet. "Okay," I said, my voice sharp, pulling him from his trance. "New plan. The old plan was to go for a swim. The new plan is we're activating." "Activating?" he croaked, his eyes wide. "What are we activating? My homeowner's insurance?" "The Maple Creek Ad Hoc Emergency Response Committee," I announced. "You're now my acting director of logistics and communications. First task. You have everyone's number from the neighborhood directory, right? Create a group chat. Text everyone. Tell them there's been an incident at the clubhouse and we need an emergency meeting. Tonight. My garage. Call the group. Maple Creek United." I paused. "No. Wait. Call it Operation Brenda's Flood. On second thought, maybe stick with the first one. Be diplomatic for now." Brenda, who had been frozen in place, finally found her voice. "You can't do that," she sputtered, her voice a reedy facsimile of its usual authoritarian boom. "I am the president. This is HOA property. You have no authority." I turned to her, my gaze level. For the first time, I wasn't looking at her as an annoying neighbor, but as a failed local authority whose incompetence was now a direct threat to public safety. "Brenda," I said, my voice low and devoid of the sarcasm I was feeling, "you have intentionally or through criminal negligence created a Class 3 public health hazard. You have disabled a piece of critical civil infrastructure, a county-registered emergency shelter less than 3 days before a major hurricane makes landfall. This situation has now escalated far beyond the pay grade of the Garden Gnome Compliance Subcommittee. So, with all due respect, shut up." I turned to Officer Miller, who had been watching this exchange with a look of grim fascination. "Officer, my name is Alex Martinez. For 15 years, I was a senior operations commander for Crisis Command. I'm certified in disaster site management and emergency remediation. I am officially taking operational control of this site to mitigate the damage and attempt to make it viable before the storm hits." Miller looked at me, at my cargo shorts and flip-flops, and then seemed to really see the sudden steel in my posture. He glanced at the clubhouse, then at Brenda's sputtering face. He made an executive decision. "The city's emergency services are going to be stretched thin, real thin." He pulled a card from his wallet. "Here's my cell. You have any problems, you call me directly. Just try not to burn the place down." He gave me a curt, decisive nod, shot one last weary look at Brenda, and walked back to his car. The new power structure had just been ratified. Within the hour, my garage, once a temple of suburban order, was a functioning EOC. I had rolled my massive office whiteboard out from the spare bedroom. Dave, looking both terrified and thrilled, sat at a folding table with his laptop open, a half-eaten bag of chips next to him. I grabbed a dry erase marker and started mapping out the operation. The flowchart was clear, the objectives simple. Phase 1, 0-12 hours. Dewatering, debris removal. Phase 2, 12-36 hours. Sanitation, structural assessment. Phase 3, 36-60 hours. Refit, resupply. Phase 4, 60-72 hours. Operational, ready for occupancy. Under a section labeled Resources Needed, I started a rapid-fire list. "Okay, Dave, type this up. We need industrial water pumps plural, at least 10 high-velocity air movers, 3 commercial-grade dehumidifiers, squeegees, shovels, crowbars for the baseboards, Heavy-duty contractor trash bags, at least 50. I want a dozen light-duty hazmat suits, or at least Tyvek coveralls. 95 masks for everyone doing demo. 10 gallons of bleach. 20 gallons of anti-mold biocide. Plywood 4. Well, we'll see what we need it for. And find me the number for a licensed contractor. A real one, not some handyman. Dave's fingers flew across the keyboard. A contractor? On a weekend? With a hurricane coming? They're going to be booked solid. I need someone who hates Brenda, I said, thinking out loud. A name surfaced from the depths of my memory. The guy who'd fixed my fence last year after a summer squall. He'd spent a solid hour giving me a detailed, passionate monologue about the HOA's draconian paint chip policies and Brenda's refusal to pay an invoice for a week because he'd parked his truck on the street instead of the driveway. I found his number and punched it in. Garcia Contracting. The voice was gruff. Carlos, it's Alex Martinez from over on Maple Drive. I've got an emergency job for you. It's unconventional. Pro bono, volunteer basis. Martinez, he grunted. Good to hear from you. But I'm swamped, man. This hurricane's got everyone losing their minds. I'm boarding up windows from here to Tampa. It's at the HOA clubhouse, I said, letting the words hang in the air. Brenda flooded it. The silence on the other end of the line was long and profound. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Then, a low, deep chuckle rumbled through the phone. Tell me everything, he said. I gave him the 2-minute summary. The hose, the Beanie Babies, the hurricane. That woman, Carlos said with the heat of a long simmering feud, is a menace to society. Another pause. Did she do it on purpose? The evidence is compelling, I replied. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, his voice suddenly full of energy. I'm bringing my son-in-law, my big generator, and my 3-inch trash pump. The one I use for draining swimming pools. Don't you pay those other guys boarding up your windows. My guys will do it, no charge. This one, he said with genuine glee, is for the soul. Carlos Garcia arrived not in a standard work truck, but in a Ford F-350 dually that sounded like a freight train, towing a trailer that carried a generator the size of a smart car and a bright red water pump. He was a stocky man, with a weathered face and arms like oak branches. He took one look at the flooded clubhouse, then walked into my garage and stared at the whiteboard. A slow grin spread across his face. Okay, boss, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. I like your style. Where do we start? As Carlos's massive pump roared to life, sucking the Beanie Baby swamp out of the clubhouse and spewing it into a storm drain down the street, Brenda launched her inevitable counter-offensive. An email, dripping with impotent rage and questionable legal threats, landed in every inbox in Maple Creek Estates. Urgent. Rogue actions at clubhouse, the subject line screamed. It has come to my attention that a resident, in flagrant violation of all HOA bylaws, has illegally seized control of community property. They are performing unauthorized, uninsured, and dangerous demolition work, exposing our entire HOA to massive liability. All residents are hereby forbidden from assisting in this rogue action. Anyone who participates will be subject to the maximum fines allowed under our governing documents and may face further legal action. The flooding was a minor plumbing incident that the board was in the process of handling through the proper channels. Dave showed me the email on his phone, his face pale. Maximum fines? Legal action? Alex, she's threatening to sue the whole neighborhood. She's not threatening, I said, watching Carlos's crew efficiently start ripping out soggy baseboards. She's panicking. She's lost control of the narrative. It's time for a strategic communication. I sat down at Dave's laptop and began to type. My tone was the antithesis of hers, calm, factual, professional, and ever so slightly heroic. I attached my old work signature, a detail I knew would not be missed. Subject: Update on clubhouse remediation, hurricane prep. I wrote. Hi neighbors, as we all know, Hurricane Ophelia is now a major storm and is projected to make landfall in our area in under 60 hours. Unfortunately, our community's designated emergency shelter suffered a significant flood last night, leaving it unusable. a team of dedicated community volunteers, working with licensed and insured local contractor Carlos Garcia, is now working around the clock to ensure the shelter is safe, clean, and operational before the storm arrives. We are following all FEMA and County Health Department guidelines for remediating Category 3 water damage to prevent long-term black mold and structural issues. All work is being professionally documented. This is a community effort to protect our homes and our families. If you would like to help by donating supplies, bottled water, trash bags, your time, or simply some coffee and snacks for the crew, please reply to this email or stop by my garage at 142 Maple Drive. We are all in this together. Stay safe, Alex. And at the bottom, Alex Martinez, Senior Operations Commander, Redoke, Crisis Command. The effect was instantaneous. Dave's phone, which was logged into the neighborhood group chat, started buzzing incessantly. The community, already simmering with resentment over years of Brenda's petty tyrannies, had found its champion. The narrative had been seized. Offers of help flooded in. An elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, who had once been fined by Brenda for having excessively cheerful pink flamingo lawn ornaments, declared herself the head of the Morale and Sustenance Committee, and arrived an hour later with 2 giant thermoses of coffee and a platter of sandwiches. That woman once told me my gnomes were tacky, she said, handing me a coffee. It's time for payback. A group of 4 teenagers, who had been roaming the neighborhood looking bored now that school was canceled, showed up. Can we, help or something? One of them asked. Absolutely, I said, pointing to the mountain of soggy, stinking debris Carlos's team was piling up outside. You guys are now the debris management and disposal unit. Your mission is to bag everything that isn't nailed down. Their eyes lit up. They had a mission. An hour later, I discovered they had also started a TikTok account under the handle at HOA Disaster. The first video, set to a dramatic action movie soundtrack, was a slow-motion shot of one of them heroically punting a waterlogged Beanie Baby into the dumpster. It had 100 views already. Enraged that her decrees were being utterly ignored, Brenda played her last desperate card. She called 911 again. This time, Officer Miller returned with his shift sergeant in tow, a man with a formidable mustache and an air of absolute zero nonsense. They pulled up to a scene that looked less like a hostile takeover and more like a very efficient, very motivated community cleanup day. Carlos's professional team was moving with practice safety, Mrs. Y. Gable was directing a small convoy of neighbors dropping off water bottles, and the debris management unit was working with terrifying enthusiasm. Brenda, nearly hysterical, ran up to the sergeant's window. There, that's him, she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at me. He broke into our building and he's leading a hostile militia. He's destroying the clubhouse with sledgehammers. I saw them coming and walked over, holding a clipboard I'd borrowed from Carlos. It lent me an air of officialdom. Afternoon, Officer Sergeant, I said calmly. Glad you're here. We're well into Phase 2. Drywall demolition is nearly complete. We found significant black mold contamination behind the baseboards, exactly as predicted by the water saturation levels. I have photo documentation and Carlos's preliminary damage assessment report right here if you need a copy for your file. The sergeant looked from the professional-looking report on my clipboard to Brenda's wild-eyed ranting. He let out a slow breath. Ma'am, he said, his voice a low rumble, is this facility the designated county emergency shelter for this zip code? Well, yes, it is, but he has no right. The sergeant cut her off, turning to me. And is there a Category 3 hurricane currently heading for this county? Correct, I confirmed. Landfall ETA is now approximately 48 hours. The sergeant swiveled his head back to Brenda, his eyes like granite. Ma'am, from where I'm standing, it looks like this gentleman and the rest of your community are doing the exact job your HOA should have been doing for the last 3 days, preparing for a declared state of emergency. This isn't an HOA matter anymore. It's a public safety issue. So unless you have a court-ordered, judge-signed stop work order in your hand, I suggest you either pick up a broom and help, or go home. And for the love of God, stop calling 911. This is the last time this department is responding to this address for a non-criminal matter. He didn't wait for a reply. As their patrol car pulled away, Officer Miller in the passenger seat caught my eye and gave me a slow, almost imperceptible wink. The coup was complete. Brenda stood alone in the street, her authority shattered, watching her neighbors work together to undo the damage she had wrought. The clock was our new tyrant. Every news update shaved hours off our timeline and added miles per hour to Ophelia's wind speed. 36 hours to landfall. The clubhouse was a clean, hollowed-out cavern. Carlos's crew had been brutally efficient, gutting every last scrap of waterlogged drywall and insulation. The concrete floor was scrubbed with bleach, and a dozen high-velocity fans I'd procured from a sympathetic rental supply company roared day and night, creating a wind tunnel that smelled vaguely of chlorine and determination. But it was an empty victory. A clean, empty shell is just as useless in a hurricane as a flooded, moldy one. The original cots, blankets, and first aid kits were now a sodden heap in the bottom of Carlos's dumpster. "This is where amateurs fail," I muttered to Dave, who was staring at our handiwork. "They do the demo and they feel like they've won, but the logistics of resupply are the real war." He nodded, looking worried. "I called a couple of the big box stores. They're sold out of everything. Batteries, water, flashlights. Forget about cots. The shelves are stripped bare." "Exactly," I said. "You can't buy your way out of a crisis at the last minute. You have to have the supply chain in place before the panic starts." I retreated to my garage EOC, the eye of our own little storm. The whiteboard was covered in notes and checklists. Dave had set up a laptop to track the hurricane's path, while his own phone buzzed constantly with updates from the neighborhood group chat. The TikTok account, he informed me with a grin, had now surpassed 1,000 followers and had been featured on a local news blog. Brenda's flood was trending in our little corner of Florida. It was time to pull the big lever. I scrolled through the contacts on my personal cell, past Carlos the contractor and Dave next door, until I found the one I was looking for. It was a name I hadn't called in over a year, a contact saved under the simple, discreet label, Source. This was my emergency button, my direct line back into the world I'd left behind. The phone picked up on the second ring. "You've reached Mike. I'm either saving the world or stuck in traffic. Leave a message." "Mike, it's Alex Martinez." There was a pause, then the sound of a chair swiveling. "Alex, holy hell. I thought you fell off the face of the earth and were living in a cabin somewhere, weaving your own yogurt." "Don't tell me you're in the path of Ophelia." "I am the path of Ophelia, Mike," I said. "And I need a favor. A big one." I could hear him smile. "Let me guess. It's not a request for artisanal cheese. You sound like you did back in Port-au-Prince." "Worse. The bureaucracy here makes the Haitian Port Authority look like a well-oiled machine. Listen, remember that customs snafu? The shipment of antibiotics that was going to expire on the tarmac?" Mike laughed, a warm, booming sound. "How could I forget? You convinced a customs official that the Minister of Health was your uncle and that he'd be very disappointed to hear about the delay. I'm pretty sure you saved me from a Haitian prison. What do you need, Alex?" This was it. "I need a standard shelter kit. Crisis command spec. 50 expeditionary cots, 100 all-weather blankets, 20 family-size advanced first aid kits. Throw in 100 MREs, just in case things get sporty, and a dozen of those high-capacity LED lanterns. And Mike? I need it delivered to a residential address in suburban Florida in the next 18 hours. The silence on Mike's end was heavy. I could hear him doing the mental calculation, the sheer impossibility of what I was asking. "Alex, that's a 5-figure order of restricted non-civilian grade relief supplies. That's a full-on disaster pod. I can't just drop that in a cul-de-sac." "This is a full-on disaster," I said. "It involves a woman named Brenda and a tactical deployment of Beanie Babies. Don't ask. Can you do it? Or do I need to call your boss and remind her about that time in Nairobi?" He sighed, a sound of fond exasperation. "You're a real bastard, you know that? Fine. I'll reroute a truck that's pre-positioning for the state EOC. It'll have to be off the books. The driver will think he's making a delivery to a FEMA subcontractor. It's going to be discreet, Alex. Real discreet. But you owe me. Big time. Understood." I said. Send me the bill. And Mike? Thanks. Just try not to start a revolution, okay? He said, and hung up. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Carlos's crew, having finished the demolition, pivoted to reinforcement, boarding up the clubhouse windows with thick plywood. The neighborhood volunteers, organized by Dave into efficient teams, did the same for the homes of our elderly residents. Mrs. Gable's kitchen had become a veritable factory of sandwiches and baked goods. The sense of community was palpable, a powerful force born from a shared threat and a common enemy. Just after 2 a.m., under a sky black and starless, it happened. A monstrous, unmarked 18-wheeler, its engine a low rumble that seemed to shake the very pavement, crept down my street. It hissed to a stop in front of my house, its sheer size alien and intimidating in the quiet suburb. I was waiting in the driveway with my core team. Dave, who was bleary-eyed but buzzing with adrenaline. Carlos, who seemed to run on pure diesel fumes and spite. And 2 of the teenagers from the debris management unit, who had flatly refused to go home and were now my most dedicated disciples. A large man with a weary face and a clipboard hopped down from the cab. Got a delivery for? A Mr. Martinez? Subcontractor A, 113? That's me, I said, taking the clipboard. Right on time. For the next hour, we worked in the eerie, humid stillness of the pre-storm night. The truck's cargo bay was a treasure trove. Box after box of pristine, professional-grade relief supplies came down the ramp. The cots weren't the flimsy tube and canvas kind. They were sturdy, folding aluminum frames. The blankets were thick, self-warming mylar. The first aid kits were better stocked than a local clinic. We formed a human chain, moving the boxes from the truck, through my garage and into the clubhouse. Dave paused for a moment, hefting a box of MREs, his face a mask of awe in the dim glow of the work lights. Alex, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Who are you? I grabbed a box of the LED lanterns and nudged him forward. I'm just a guy who really hates mold and poor planning, I said. Now let's get this stuff inside before the first rain bands hit. We worked through the night, transforming the empty cavern into a sanctuary. We laid down the temporary rubber flooring Carlos had found at one of his work sites. We set up the cots in neat, orderly rows. We designated a medical area, a communications desk, and a food station. We finished just as the first gray light of dawn began to silhouette the churning, bruised purple clouds of Ophelia's leading edge. The storm arrived with a roar. The wind shrieked, and the rain came down not in drops, but in solid, horizontal sheets that hammered against the newly boarded windows. Inside, however, it was an island of calm. The low hum of Carlos's generator provided power for the lights. Families from the neighborhood, their faces etched with worry, trickled in. I checked them in at the door, my voice calm and reassuring. Dave sat at the communications desk, a folding table with a half-dozen power strips, helping people text their relatives. And in the corner, holding court behind a mountain of food, sat Mrs. Gable, a benevolent queen on her throne. About an hour after the main power grid failed, plunging the world outside into a howling, wind-swept darkness, the main doors were flung open with a crash. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the gray maelstrom. It was Brenda, drenched and wild-eyed, her helmet of hair finely defeated, plastered to her skull. She looked like a mad queen surveying the wreckage of her kingdom. "What is this?" she screeched, trying to make herself heard over the generator and the storm. "What have you done? This is an unsanctioned gathering. This is a party." A little girl, no older than 7, who was sitting on a cot coloring in a book, looked up at her mother. "Mommy," she asked in a loud, clear voice, "is that the bad lady from TikTok?" The room went quiet. I walked toward Brenda, my steps measured. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "Brenda," I said, my voice low enough that she had to strain to hear me. "It's a hurricane. People are scared. You will not come in here and disturb them." I pointed to a cot. "You have 2 choices. You can come in, take a blanket, and find a quiet spot. Or you can go back out into the storm. But either way, your authority ends at that door. You are not in charge here." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She looked past me, at the faces of her neighbors. She saw no fear, no deference. She saw only annoyance and pity. From the corner, Mrs. Gable's voice cut through the tension. "Brenda, dear," she said, holding up a paper plate with a large slice of apple pie on it. "Shut your mouth and have some pie, or go back out in the rain. Your choice." Defeated. Utterly and completely defeated. She shuffled past me, a ghost in her own clubhouse. She took the single empty cot in the furthest, darkest corner, wrapped one of the high-quality emergency blankets around her shoulders, and for the first time since I'd met her, fell completely silent. Later, during a brief lull in the storm's fury, Dave and I did a perimeter check, making sure the plywood boards were holding. As we passed the utility room, Dave noticed something wedged behind the industrial water heater that Carlos's team had wrestled away from the wall. He reached down and pulled it out. It was Brenda's iPad, miraculously dry in its thick leather case. Curiosity got the better of him. He pressed the power button. It flickered to life, unlocked. Open on the screen was a half-composed email draft. The recipient was the HOA's insurance adjuster. The subject line read, "Claim. Act of God flood damage." The body of the email was a masterful work of fiction, detailing a sudden and catastrophic pipe rupture and the tragic loss of valuable community assets. But the real treasure was the browser history. It was a digital confession. How to flood a room and make it look like an accident. Does homeowners insurance cover mold from floods? Average time for black mold to grow. How to file emergency injunction against neighbor. Dave held the iPad out to me, his eyes wide. I read the screen, my face impassive. A slow, grim smile touched my lips. I took the device from him, closed the cover, and slid it into the large pocket of my cargo shorts. Checkmate. The morning after was eerily quiet. The hurricane, having spent its fury, had been downgraded to a tropical storm and was now just a curtain of gray drizzle. The world outside was a wreck of downed tree limbs, scattered palm fronds, and overturned garbage cans. But our little island, our neighborhood, was safe. The clubhouse had held. Inside, a sense of weary camaraderie filled the air as people began to pack their things. We had made it. As the last family left, thanking me with tired smiles, I stood in the middle of the room with Dave, Carlos, Mrs. Blank, Gable, and the other two members of the HOA board, two meek men who had spent the storm huddled in a corner, looking terrified of both the hurricane and Brenda. Brenda herself was trying to slip out the side door, but Carlos, anticipating the move, had conveniently placed a large tool chest in front of it. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a silent, immovable guard. "Before everyone leaves," I announced, my voice echoing slightly in the near-empty room, "I believe it's time for an emergency HOA meeting." I didn't grandstand. I didn't raise my voice. I simply laid out the facts like I was delivering a post-mission briefing. "We have some administrative matters to discuss," I began, pulling a folder from my go-bag. "First, an invoice." I placed a piece of paper on the folding table. "From Carlos Garcia Contracting, for professional water damage remediation, demolition, and structural repair. The total is $10,450. Carlos has generously waived his usual emergency rates." Carlos gave a short, sharp nod. "Second," I continued, placing another document on the table, "an invoice for emergency relief supplies, which I will be submitting to my former employer and which our community will need to repay. Cots, blankets, medical kits, food. The total is $15,200. The two board members winced. "And third," I paused, pulling the iPad from my pocket and placing it gently on the table, "a piece of lost property." I powered it on and opened the email draft, then the browser history. I turned the device so the board members could see it clearly. "This is Brenda's proposed insurance claim for the act of God flood damage, along with some of her preliminary research on the topic." The silence in the room was absolute. The two men stared at the screen, their faces turning from pale to a sickly green. They read the search queries, each one a nail in Brenda's coffin. "Mrs. Ins..." Gable peered over their shoulders, her lips pursed in a thin, hard line. "I see," one of the board members finally whispered, unable to look at Brenda. Dave stepped forward. "In light of this new information," he said, his voice ringing with newfound confidence, "I'd like to make a motion for a vote of no confidence in President Brenda and for her immediate removal from the board on the grounds of gross negligence, willful destruction of property, and insurance fraud." "I second it." Mrs. Gable's voice was sharp as a tack. "All in favor?" Dave asked. "Aye." The chorus was unanimous, a mixture of anger and relief. Brenda was officially deposed. She was also informed in no uncertain terms by the previously meek board members that the community would be filing a civil suit against her personally to recoup the full $25,000 in damages. She stared at me, her eyes full of a venomous hatred that was oddly satisfying. Without another word, she turned and walked out the main doors, a queen exiled from her own ruined kingdom, a pariah in the very community she had tried to rule with an iron fist. 2 weeks later, life had found its new normal. The neighborhood was different, changed. The fear and isolation of the storm had been replaced by a powerful, easygoing sense of community. There were impromptu barbecues. Neighbors who had only ever exchanged polite nods now stopped to chat. The sense of shared victory was a potent social glue. After a week of intense pressure and the promise of free beer for life, Dave had reluctantly accepted the role of interim HOA president. His first official act was to send a single email to the entire neighborhood. The subject line read, "No new rules." The body of the email read, "That's it. That's the email." He was already being hailed as the greatest leader in Maple Creek history. I was back in my sanctuary, my home office. Back in my element. On my monitors, a UN agricultural expert was explaining the devastating flight path of a locust swarm across East Africa. It was a complex problem with immense stakisa potential famine affecting millions. I was mapping out flight paths for crop-dusting planes, sourcing jet fuel, and navigating the political minefield of 3 different countries. I was deep in the zone, the familiar, controlled chaos, a comforting hum. I was finally getting my boring life back. There was a soft knock on my office door. It was Dave, holding 2 bottles of beer, an expression of genuine panic on his face. "Alex," he said, his voice hushed and urgent. "Code red. We have a situation at the clubhouse." My blood ran cold. My mind instantly leaped to worst-case scenarios. Not again. Did someone else find a hose? Is it on fire? Did a sinkhole open up under the pool? I muted my call. "What is it, Dave?" I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "What's the threat level? Is it flooded?" "Worse," he said, his eyes wide. "It's an emergency. A real one." I leaned forward, my crisis commander instincts flaring back to life against my will. "Talk to me. What's happening?" "It's Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She's in a standoff with the park committee. A schism. They want to plant zinnias along the main entrance, but she's insisting that marigolds are more welcoming and repel pests. She's threatening to secede from the welcome committee and form her own rogue beautification task force. People are taking sides, Alex. It's a total breakdown of governance. We need you to mediate." I stared at Dave's genuinely terrified face. I looked at my computer screen, where a satellite image showed a biblical plague of insects devouring the food supply of an entire region. I looked back at Dave, who was on the verge of a nervous breakdown over a suburban flower dispute. Then, a strange sound bubbled up from my chest. It was a laugh. Not a chuckle, but a deep, genuine, uncontrollable laugh that shook my entire body. I leaned back in my expensive ergonomic chair and laughed until tears streamed down my face. The quiet life I had so desperately wanted was a fantasy, a mirage. I had traded warlords for gardeners, typhoons for TikTok drama, and international incidents for internecine floral conflicts. This absurd, ridiculous, chaotic, and wonderful community was my new disaster zone. I took one of the beers from Dave's hand and gestured toward the door with it. "All right, Mr. President," I said, taking a long swallow. "Let's go negotiate a peace treaty."